There are moments in life when the deepest wounds don't come from an enemy, but from the very person you loved, protected, and sacrificed for the most. Imagine raising someone from childhood, giving them everything you had: your time, your affection, your sense of security, only to be treated years later as if you were a burden, like an old piece of furniture that no longer matches the decor. That was the reality for Mary Thompson, a 62-year-old woman who believed that adopting James Miller had given her not only a son, but the very reason for her existence. And what did she get in return? Closed doors, cold words, and a letter disguised as what's best for you when, in truth, it was nothing more than convenience for him. But this is not just a story about rejection. It's about unexpected turns, about how a single overlooked clause buried deep in a contract could hold the power to rewrite a destiny. It's about the courage to stand up to powerful people, to chase the truth even when it means staring real threats in the face. Mary had no idea that being forced out of her home would mark the beginning of the most important battle of her life, a fight that would expose a network of real estate fraud, money laundering, and even murder. Along this journey, you'll discover how a small flash drive became more valuable than gold, why a bridge called Willow Creek would become the stage for both tragedy and redemption, and how a family farm, a symbol of sacrifice and roots, could find its way back into the hands of the woman who had always cared for it with love. Don't expect a fairy tale. What you're about to hear is a story of resilience, justice, and rebuilding from the ashes. And maybe, by the end, you'll understand that even the deepest betrayals can clear the path toward our greatest purposes. Because when blood fails to honor its bond, the truth has its own way of making justice happen. Mary Thompson had always believed that love and gratitude walked hand in hand. After all, she had given James Miller more than just a roof over his head. She had given him a new story, a future that was unwritten. When she met him, he was only 7 years old, with frightened eyes and a heavy silence that spoke louder than words. Raising him was an act of faith. She witnessed his first smiles, stayed up through nights of childhood fevers, sat in the audience at every school play even when he insisted, "You don't need to come." That's why, when at 62 years old she heard James say she no longer fit into his lifestyle, it felt as if the ground beneath her feet gave way. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Cold. Detached. As if the woman who had saved him from a life in an orphanage had now become an inconvenience. The scene wasn't a dramatic shouting match with slammed doors and broken dishes. No, it was worse. It was silent. Mary sat in the living room of his house, a place where every corner held a memory she had helped build, and listened to James and his wife Victoria talk about a new phase and needing more space for the family. They offered her money, as if throwing numbers at her could soothe a guilty conscience. What they didn't understand was that there are things no amount of money can buy. Their so-called help wasn't help at all, it was an eviction wrapped in polite words. Mary realized in that moment that the boy she had raised had grown into a calculating man, far removed from the love she once knew. The move to the nursing home was quick, perhaps too quick. James took care of all the logistics, as he called them, avoiding her gaze during the process. Mary, on the other hand, took her time packing, as if placing each object into a box was also tucking away pieces of herself. When she arrived at the nursing home, she noticed the room was small, but it wasn't the size that made it feel suffocating. What truly crushed her was the awareness that her story with James had ended there, on an ordinary morning, without warning. And that no matter how much she wished, there was no turning back time. From her new room, Mary began reflecting on how relationships can shift without us realizing it. Small gestures, words said in a different tone, long silences, all signs she had once ignored. She had always believed that the people you raise are, in some way, yours forever. But life, in its cruel sense of irony, was proving otherwise. And that realization hurt. It hurt like a deep wound that bleeds slowly. It's in moments like these that you understand betrayal isn't just the breaking of a promise of love, it's the erasing of the value of an entire shared history. The room had a single window overlooking the garden. Mary began watching the flowers as if they held a lesson in resilience. They bloom even after the harshest winters, she whispered to herself, trying to believe she could start again too. Some of the staff, noticing her reserved demeanor, tried to make conversation. Mary responded with polite smiles, but never revealed too much. How could she tell them her own son had sent her away to this place? How could she explain that the abandonment had come from the last person she expected? It was easier to say she was adjusting and change the subject. Yet behind the sadness, there was a flicker of something Mary couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly hope, it was more like a premonition. Her life couldn't end like this, in a small room, far from the family farm that had once been her pride and a living symbol of her family's sacrifices. Deep down, she knew a piece of the puzzle was still missing. And maybe, just maybe, fate still had one final card for her to play. On the day she left James' house, Mary took only the essentials: a small suitcase, a worn photo album, and a wooden box she had kept closed for years. Inside were keepsakes from another time, letters, documents, and one or two secrets she had never dared revisit. What she didn't know was that within those yellowed pages lay the key to a twist in her life that not even the best films could have prepared her for. The nursing home, with its faint scent of weak coffee and its long, hushed hallways, would become the stage where this discovery began to take shape. Mary didn't cry in front of James. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But the moment she was alone in her new room, the tears came without warning, heavy and unstoppable. They weren't the kind of tears that bring relief, they were the kind that only confirm the depth of your pain. And as they rolled down her cheeks, she found herself asking, how can someone who received so much love turn so cold? Maybe the answer lay somewhere within James himself. Maybe it was in the people around him, or perhaps in the corrosive influence of money, that silent force capable of turning character into just another commodity to be traded. She didn't have the answer yet. But soon, much sooner than she could have imagined, she would have every reason to believe that being thrown out hadn't simply been an act of ingratitude. It was, in fact, the first calculated move in something far bigger. Settling into the nursing home was not an easy task for Mary Thompson. Between the constant smell of disinfectant lingering in the halls and the faint, ever-present murmur of televisions from other rooms, she tried to get used to her new routine. One quiet afternoon, as she was unpacking the last of her few boxes, her gaze fell on the old wooden box she had brought with her. It wasn't just a container of memories, it was, in many ways, a treasure chest of her life. Inside were old letters, faded photographs, receipts, and mementos from a time long past. But nestled among them was something she hadn't thought about in years: a crumpled brown envelope, its edges worn and soft from age. When she opened it, she froze. It was the original sales contract for her old family farm, that piece of land that carried far more than a monetary value. It held her family's history, their sacrifices, their pride. The date on the document transported her back more than a decade, to the day she signed it over to a company called Westfield Development. At the time, she'd been drowning in debt and had no other options. She could still remember the company's representative, speaking in warm, persuasive tones about sustainable housing projects and honoring local heritage, as if he were a poet of progress rather than a businessman. But on that afternoon, sitting in her small nursing home room with the contract in her hands, something else caught her attention: a sudden, vivid memory of a small but significant detail. The reversion clause. It was a specific paragraph buried in the middle of the document, stating that if the land was not developed into sustainable housing within 10 years, ownership would automatically revert to the original owner. Mary's heart began to pound. Could the deadline have already passed? Had they truly built what they promised? Or had the land been left undeveloped, or worse, repurposed for something entirely different? It wasn't just idle curiosity. This was a spark, a sudden ignition of something deep inside her, something she thought had gone cold long ago. She grabbed her reading glasses and scanned the paper again. There it was, in smaller print but perfectly clear. This one clause could be the key to reclaiming not only the farm, but also a part of herself that had been lost the day she sold it. The problem was, she had no idea what the current state of the property was. Had houses been built? Was it still just empty land? She knew she couldn't figure it all out on her own. And that's when, late one sleepless night, another memory surfaced: the name Diane Cooper. Diane was a lawyer Mary had helped many years earlier, back when Diane was fresh out of law school, still struggling to get her career off the ground. Mary had offered her help without a second thought. Back then, she never imagined she would one day need to call in that favor or perhaps collect on it. The next morning, with a cup of watery coffee in her hand, Mary dialed Diane's number. She had no idea if it was still the same after all these years, but she had to try. To her surprise, Diane's voice, warm, energetic, and just as Mary remembered, answered on the other end. After a few brief words about the years gone by, Mary got straight to the point. She needed to verify the validity of a certain clause and determine if there was any real chance of reclaiming her family's farm. Intrigued, Diane told her to scan the contract and send it immediately. There was something in her voice, a mix of professionalism and genuine excitement, that told Mary this could be more than just a long shot. Mary spent the rest of the day anxiously waiting for Diane's call. When it finally came, the lawyer's voice was crisp and certain the clause was absolutely valid. Even more interesting, Diane suspected that the property had not been used for the sustainable housing project promised in the contract. "If I'm right, Mary," Diane said, "you may have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here." In that moment, hope stopped being a distant, faded memory. It became something tangible again, something she could almost hold in her hands. But it wasn't going to be simple. Diane warned her that in order to make a claim, they'd need to dig deeper into who currently controlled the property. A quick search of public records revealed something intriguing. The land had been sold by Westfield Development to a company called Pinnacle Estates. The name meant nothing to Mary at first, but it triggered an immediate reaction from Diane. Shell companies were nothing new in the legal world, and this one had all the hallmarks of a front for something more covert. That quiet sense that something larger and darker was at play began to settle heavily over them both. That night, Mary sat staring at the contract under the warm, dim glow of her bedside lamp. The words on the page, which once felt like an ending, now read like the opening lines of a new chapter. In the distance, an old radio played soft, nostalgic music. She didn't yet know exactly what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain, that reversion clause was no longer just a forgotten detail buried in legal jargon. It was the first step toward something bigger. Something she hadn't planned, but that fate seemed to have been quietly preparing all along. Diane Cooper wasn't just a capable lawyer, she had that rare kind of gaze that seemed to read far more than the words you spoke out loud. Mary remembered clearly the day they first met. Diane was young, freshly graduated, filled with ambition but weighed down by student loans and uncertainty. Mary had offered her a room at the farm for a few months while she got back on her feet, asking for nothing in return. Now, so many years later, life had a way of bringing their paths together again. When Diane received the contract and heard Mary's explanation about the reversion clause, she didn't just see a legal technicality. She saw an opening, a rare opportunity to restore justice where it had been denied. Their first in-person meeting took place in Diane's office. Mary noticed how much she had changed. The young, uncertain woman was gone. In her place stood a confident, well-respected figure in the legal world. Shelves lined with real estate law books, neatly labeled files, and a spotless desk spoke of discipline and focus. But her smile, that same warm, reassuring smile from years ago, hadn't changed a bit. Diane listened carefully, letting Mary recount everything from the day she sold the farm, to the cold, calculated way James had moved her into the nursing home. She only interrupted to ask precise, pointed questions, jotting down notes with an attention that made Mary feel, for the first time in weeks, truly heard. When Diane finally set her pen down, her verdict was firm. The clause was legal, enforceable, and still in effect. And then came the first real crack in the facade. She had discovered that the sale to Pinnacle Estates was highly irregular, with numbers far above market value. "This smells like fraud," Diane said, adjusting her glasses as she studied the public records. For Mary, that word fraud was like a key turning in a lock. The door to a much larger truth was starting to open. Diane explained that companies like Pinnacle often served as smokescreens, hiding the true beneficiaries behind layers of paperwork and shell corporations. And then, she revealed the detail that would change everything. James Miller, Mary's own adopted son, was directly tied to Pinnacle Estates. Leaning forward, Diane placed a set of documents in front of Mary, proof that James and Michael Westfield, the son of Westfield Development's founder, were silent partners. The shock was visceral. Mary had already known James had grown distant, cold, unrecognizable. But she had never imagined he could be entangled in something criminal. It was a bittersweet revelation, the bitter sting of betrayal, mixed with the grim satisfaction of finally seeing the truth. Diane, however, didn't flinch. "Mary, this is more serious than it looks. If we go all the way, we'll be poking at some very powerful people. But if we don't, they'll keep making money and destroying lives." Her voice was steady, resolute. Mary took a deep breath. Facing James would mean burning whatever fragile bridge still existed between them. But in her heart, she knew that bridge had already collapsed the day he shut the door on her. Now, this was no longer just about her. This was about justice and about reclaiming the farm that had been the heart of her family's story. Together, they sketched out an initial plan. Diane would file an injunction to freeze all Pinnacle activity on the property until the reversion clause was settled. At the same time, they would begin digging into the financial transactions, tracing every dollar. Mary, though she had no legal training, was determined to help. She began gathering old letters, photographs, and documents that proved her long-standing connection to the land. Every scrap of evidence felt like a puzzle piece, one that might, in the end, reveal the full picture. Over the following days, Diane became more than just an attorney. She became a partner, a confidant, and, in many ways, Mary's lifeline. She called every evening with updates, sent text messages to keep Mary's spirits up, and sometimes even arrived in person with strong coffee when she sensed her client was exhausted. For Mary, who had lost her trust in the people closest to her, this loyalty was a rare and unexpected gift. It was proof that, even when blood ties failed, there were still people in the world worth trusting. When they finally signed their first legal filing together, Mary felt it, that invisible threshold she was crossing. From that point on, there was no turning back. She was no longer just a 62-year-old woman trying to survive in a nursing home. She was a woman on a mission, with a determined lawyer at her side and a clause buried in a contract that could turn the entire game around. What neither of them knew was that, in chasing this lead, they were about to uncover truths far darker than a simple land fraud. The meeting with Richard Westfield was not arranged casually. Diane orchestrated it with surgical precision, knowing there would be no room for improvisation. Every question had to be calculated, every silence purposeful. The goal was to extract as much information as possible without giving away too much of their own hand. Richard, the founder of Westfield Development, was a man in his mid-50s with an impeccable posture and a reputation for being both charming and shrewd. But Mary noticed something in his eyes the moment they shook hands, a deep weariness, the kind that comes from decades of negotiations and perhaps regrets. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sitting across from Mary and Diane, he took a slow breath and said, almost as if confessing, "I always knew that one day someone would come looking for answers about this." It was the first indication that he had more to say than they had anticipated. Richard explained that when Mary's farm had first been purchased, the original intention had been to build the sustainable housing he had promised her. But years later, his own son, Michael Westfield, had entered into a partnership with James Miller to create Pinnacle Estates. The operation, Richard admitted, was designed not to develop the land, but to artificially inflate its value, resell it to investors, and funnel the excess profit into hidden accounts. It was a scheme for quick money, and in the process, funds were quietly siphoned away for purposes that, he suggested, would be far more difficult to explain in court. He spoke with a mix of shame and anger, like a man who had lost control of a creation that had turned against him. Mary listened in silence, but each new detail cut deeper. Hearing James' name over and over again, not just as a participant, but as a central figure in the fraud, felt like twisting the knife in an old wound. Diane, however, remained laser-focused, scribbling notes, marking dates, and underlining every mention of associated companies. Then Richard's tone shifted. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What they did goes far beyond real estate fraud. There is criminal money flowing through all of this. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the room like a heavy fog. Without another word, Richard reached for the leather briefcase at his side and drew out a small flash drive. Placing it gently but deliberately on the table, he slid it toward Mary. "On here," he said, "are emails, contracts, and spreadsheets that track every step of the operation, including the transactions tying James and Michael to offshore accounts. But be careful. This is enough to bring down some very powerful people, and they will not sit back and let it happen." The flash drive seemed to weigh far more than its size should allow, not in grams, but in consequence. Richard went on to reveal that he himself had been receiving quiet threats ever since he began questioning his son's actions: anonymous messages, unmarked envelopes, strange cars parked near his home for hours. Meeting Mary and Diane, he said, was his way of passing the responsibility forward, as if handing over a live bomb in the hope they could defuse it before it exploded. Mary felt the moral weight of what he was doing. This was no longer just about reclaiming her land, this was about stopping a machine that could ruin countless other lives. Diane, always the strategist, picked up the flash drive with the utmost care. "This," she said firmly, "is ammunition. We need to know exactly when and how to use it." Mary agreed, but an involuntary shiver ran through her. She knew from that moment on, she was officially on the radar of people who would go to any length to protect their empire. And knowing James as she did, she was certain he would not hesitate to get his hands dirty. The drive back to the nursing home was quiet. Mary stared out the car window, watching the city blur past, but her mind was miles away. She kept seeing James as the boy she had taken in at 7 years old and wondering at what exact moment he had been lost to her. Had this, the fraud, the laundering, the threats, all been in his mind from the very beginning? Or had he simply been seduced by the wrong people, the wrong opportunities? The answers would come in time. But one thing was already painfully clear: whatever conflict remained between them was beyond repair. That night, Mary barely slept. The flash drive now sat in a small locked box in her room, but it was as if it had a pulse of its own, like every file inside it was quietly demanding to be revealed. And despite the fear, she knew there was no turning back. Fate had placed this evidence in her hands, and to ignore it would be to stand on the wrong side of the truth. The next step was inevitable: she would have to face James, and let him know she already knew everything. The first threat didn't arrive in the form of an anonymous phone call or a cryptic letter slipped under a door. It came in the form of James Miller himself, standing in the shadows, crossing the threshold of Diane Cooper's home uninvited on a stormy night. Mary had been sitting on the living room sofa, quietly reviewing a stack of documents, when she heard the sharp, metallic sound of the front door lock being forced open. Diane had stepped out to her office just a few blocks away to retrieve a file they needed for the next day's legal filing, leaving Mary alone in the house. The sound of heavy, rain-soaked boots echoed on the polished hardwood floor. And then he emerged from the dim light of the entryway. For a split second, Mary's breath caught in her throat. The boy she had once held in her arms now stood before her, his expression carved from stone, his presence carrying the kind of menace you can feel in your bones. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were low, deliberate, the kind that carried more danger precisely because they were whispered. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," he said, stepping forward just enough for the light from the street lamp outside to catch his face. "You still have time to walk away from this nonsense." It wasn't just a threat. It was the kind of warning that sounded almost like advice, poisonous advice meant to lure you into silence. Mary said nothing. She sat still, gripping the edge of the document folder in her lap to stop her hands from shaking. James took another slow step forward. "Give back what you have," he continued, his voice sharper now. "Go back to your life. You have no idea who you're messing with." Every word dripped with a mix of contempt and certainty, as if he believed, deep down, that she wouldn't have the strength to stand her ground. But before Mary could respond, the front door burst open again. Diane stepped inside, flipping the light switch on, and the tension in the room snapped taut. Her voice was sharp, almost cutting through the air like a blade. "You need to leave. Now." James turned toward her, that faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smirk that says, "I'm not afraid of you." He began to walk toward the door, slow and measured, as if to prove he was leaving on his own terms. But at the threshold, he stopped and looked back. "You have 48 hours, he said flatly. "After that, I can't promise anyone's safety in this house." The door closed behind him with a quiet click, but the weight of his presence lingered like smoke that refuses to clear. The next morning, Diane filed a formal police report. A patrol car was assigned to watch the street for a few days, but Mary knew this would do little to deter the kind of people James was now connected to. These were not men who made idle threats. Still, she refused to run. "If he thinks he can scare me," she told Diane, her voice steady but her hands still trembling slightly, "then he doesn't know me at all." The truth was, she was afraid. But the fear came hand in hand with a fire that burned hotter than she had felt in years. From that day forward, Mary began taking precautions. She changed her daily routine, avoided walking alone, and locked every window in her room even in the middle of the day. At Diane's insistence, they moved the flash drive and all related documents to a secure deposit box at a bank. If anything happened to them, the evidence would survive. But the sense of unease didn't fade. It only deepened when, 2 nights later, someone tried to break into Diane's car parked out front. Nothing was stolen, but deep scratches marked the door, and a folded note was tucked beneath the windshield wiper. "Last warning." No signature. No explanation. Just 2 words that sent a clear message. They were running out of time. Diane handed the note to the police, who now considered the case a potential stalking and intimidation matter. For Mary, the note didn't just confirm the danger, it cemented the fact that they were already at war. This was no longer simply about reclaiming a piece of land. This was about surviving a counterattack from people who operated in the shadows. Yet strangely, with every threat, her determination only grew stronger. It was as if every attempt to scare her made her more certain she was on the right path. Diane seemed to sense this shift. She doubled down on the legal front, filing an emergency motion to freeze all of Pinnacle Estates' assets, preventing them from making any financial moves until the court could hear the case. Mary understood now that the fight had moved beyond family disputes and beyond simple legal matters. They were in dangerous territory, a place where money and power were valued above human life. And yet, each step forward brought her closer to justice and further away from any hope of reconciliation with James. The next chapter of the battle would play out in the courtroom, where the masks would finally start to crack. The courthouse was crowded that morning, the air inside heavy with that peculiar mix of anticipation and formality. The hum of quiet conversations echoed off the marble walls, the shuffle of papers blending with the sharp click of heels across the polished floor. Mary Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table beside Diane Cooper, her back straight but her fingers interlocked tightly in her lap. She could feel the pulse in her wrists, each beat quick and strong, matching the pace of her racing thoughts. It was the first time she would face James Miller in a place where words would be recorded, weighed, and judged. A place where the truth would not be a matter of opinion, but a matter of evidence. Across the room, James sat at the defense table, perfectly groomed in a tailored suit, his posture confident, too confident, like someone who believed he could talk his way out of anything. Victoria sat just behind him, dressed in muted elegance, her gaze sharp and assessing. When James glanced toward Mary, there was no warmth, no flicker of recognition for the years they had shared. Only a cool, measured look, like a man sizing up an opponent. Diane leaned toward Mary, her tone low but steady. "Remember, today isn't about emotions. It's about facts. Let me do the talking, and we'll make every word count." Mary nodded, but the storm inside her didn't quiet. She could still hear James' voice from that night at Diane's house, could still feel the weight of the flash drive in her hands, and could still see the farm in her mind, the way it looked in the early morning light, the way it smelled after a summer rain. That land was more than property. It was her history, her family's sacrifice, her life. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with a calm but commanding presence. She glanced over the case file before looking directly at both tables. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice firm but even. Diane rose first, her presence instantly commanding the room. She began by laying out the history of the property, the original sale to Westfield Development, and the reversion clause that was central to the case. She didn't rush. Every sentence was deliberate, every pause calculated to let the words settle. Then, with the quiet confidence of someone holding an ace, she introduced the evidence. Your Honor, we have in our possession not only the original contract, clearly outlining the 10-year development requirement, but also documented proof that this clause was never fulfilled. Furthermore, Diane continued, locking eyes with the judge, we have evidence of subsequent transactions involving Pinnacle Estates, a company directly tied to Mr. Miller, which indicate fraudulent inflation of the property's value and diversion of funds to undisclosed accounts. At that, Diane walked to the evidence table and placed the flash drive, now sealed in a labeled evidence bag, in front of the clerk. This contains emails, contracts, and transaction records obtained from Richard Westfield, founder of Westfield Development, who is prepared to testify to the authenticity of these files. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of tension moving through the gallery. James shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. For the first time since the proceedings began, his polished composure wavered. Mary didn't take her eyes off him. She wanted him to feel her presence there, not as the woman he thought he had removed from his life, but as the person now standing in direct opposition to everything he had tried to build on lies. When it was the defense's turn, James' attorney spoke with a smooth, practiced tone, painting Mary as a sentimental woman clinging to the past, someone who had misunderstood the realities of modern business. But the longer he spoke, the more hollow his words seemed against the weight of the documents Diane had placed on record. At one point, the judge leaned forward, interrupting the defense counsel. Are you denying that the reversion clause exists in this contract? She asked, tapping the file in front of her. The attorney hesitated just long enough for the silence to work against him. No, Your Honor, he finally admitted, but we contend. The judge raised her hand. Then your contention is with its enforcement, not its existence. Diane seized the opening, methodically dismantling the defense's position with one piece of evidence after another. By the time she finished, the picture she had painted was unshakable. The clause was valid, the conditions had not been met, and the subsequent sales were riddled with irregularities pointing to intentional fraud. Mary felt something shift in the room, not victory yet, but momentum. When the judge adjourned for the day, she made it clear that the next hearing would include testimony from Richard Westfield and a forensic accountant to trace the money trail from the farm to the offshore accounts. As they left the courtroom, Mary caught James' gaze once more. This time, there was something new in his eyes, not remorse, not yet, but the faintest flicker of recognition that she might not be as easy to destroy as he had once believed. And for Mary, that flicker was enough to keep going. Diane, with her steady, deliberate steps, gathered the remaining exhibits and returned to the table. Mary sat motionless, her hands resting on the edge of the table, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She could feel the judge's gaze moving between her and James, weighing the human reality behind the legal arguments. The clerk logged the evidence, and the judge leaned slightly forward, speaking in that same calm yet decisive tone that had commanded the room all morning. This matter will proceed to the evidentiary hearing. Both parties are instructed to prepare all witnesses and submit full disclosure of supporting documents within the next 14 days. The gavel struck once firm, final signaling the end of the session. Mary rose slowly, her legs feeling heavier than they had in years. As she turned toward the exit, the ambient noise of the courtroom seemed to fade into a dull hum. She was acutely aware of James standing only a few feet away, his attorney speaking quickly in low tones beside him. Their eyes met briefly, no words, just the silent recognition of the war they were now fully engaged in. It was no longer a family dispute. It was a battle with rules, timelines, and stakes neither of them could afford to lose. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, colder, sharper. Diane walked beside her, already outlining the next steps, securing testimony from Richard Westfield, arranging forensic analysis of the transactions, and keeping the chain of custody for the flash drive airtight. Mary nodded as she listened, but her focus remained elsewhere. She could still see the farm in her mind, the wooden fences, the field stretching toward the horizon, the smell of earth after a fresh rain. That image wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a promise. James walked into the courtroom alongside his attorney, wearing an expensive suit and a smile that felt more like provocation than politeness. He avoided looking directly at Mary, yet she felt his presence like a shadow that refuses to leave your side. His lawyer began by trying to downplay the importance of the clause, claiming that the sale of the property had been legitimate and that any irregularities were nothing more than coincidences. But Diane was prepared. Her argument was surgical. She presented recent photographs of the land, showing there were no sustainable homes built, only temporary structures being used for undeclared activities. The most tense moment came when Diane unveiled records linking Pinnacle Estates to both James and Michael Westfield. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge, a woman with a serious expression and sharp, attentive eyes, asked Diane to continue. Next came the bank statements and international transfers, evidence that this was far more than a simple real estate transaction. Mary watched James closely, catching the flicker of discomfort on his face, even as he tried to hide it. By the end of her presentation, Diane requested 3 urgent measures: a restraining order against James, the freezing of Pinnacle Estates assets, and the immediate suspension of any construction on the property until the case was resolved. James tried to protest, but the judge, after a brief pause to review, granted every request. It was a direct hit to his arrogance. Mary felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew this was only an initial victory. Outside the courthouse, journalists were waiting. Some already knew there was a fraud investigation underway, but no one had imagined its direct connection to money laundering and the possible involvement of influential figures in the city. Diane advised Mary not to speak to the press at that moment. "Every word you say now is ammunition for them or for us. We need to control the narrative," she cautioned. Mary agreed, still processing the fact that, for the first time, the scales of justice had tilted slightly in her favor. James, on the other hand, left the courthouse with a hardened face. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look heavy with rage. Mary knew that didn't mean surrender, it meant he was going to play even dirtier. Diane knew it too, and was already planning their next moves. "This win matters," she said as they walked toward the car, "but it's going to upset a lot of people. We have to be ready for the counterattack." That night, back in her room at the retirement home, Mary replayed every moment of the hearing in her mind. The image of James being forced to hear the judge's ruling kept returning, a reminder that the fight was worth it. There was still a long road ahead, but the first battle had been won. More than that, the court's decision created a precedent that could weaken Pinnacle Estates in an irreversible way. What Mary didn't know was that, in the days to come, someone unexpected would reach out, someone from inside James' own circle, holding information that could completely change the course of the investigation. And like in every war, warnings don't always come from obvious allies. The meeting with Victoria Miller happened unexpectedly. Mary was leaving the retirement home for a short walk when she saw a car pull up across the street. The door opened, and Victoria, elegant as always, stepped out. Her high heels clicked against the asphalt with precision, as if every step had been rehearsed. Mary was surprised. She hadn't expected James' wife to come to her. Victoria's face was serious but not hostile. There was something different in her eyes, a weight that didn't seem to come only from the current situation. Without hesitation, she said, "We need to talk. Alone." They sat on a nearby bench, the shade of a tree shielding them from the sun. Victoria began with a sentence Mary never expected to hear: "James isn't the only danger in this story." The words sliced through the air, leaving Mary silent. Victoria explained that she had been noticing, over the past few months, suspicious financial movements and secret meetings between James and people she didn't recognize. "He's involved with extremely dangerous people. And I'm not just talking about greedy businessmen. These are people for whom dirty money is routine and removing obstacles is standard practice." Mary watched her closely, trying to decide whether this was manipulation or a genuine warning. Victoria seemed truly concerned, though her nervous hands betrayed her fear. Then came the most startling revelation: the flash drive you have doesn't show everything. There's proof of other crimes. Crimes that, if exposed, will put more people behind bars and may also put a target on your back. With every word, Mary felt the shadow of this scheme stretch further. Victoria said she had tried to warn James about the risks, but Head reacted with verbal aggression, making it clear he wouldn't abandon the scheme. She also suspected that Michael Westfield was laundering money for criminal organizations. What you think is just real estate fraud, Mary, is actually the tip of an iceberg. And when that iceberg flips, a lot of people are going to sink with it, she warned, looking her straight in the eyes. Mary had to ask, why tell me all this now? Victoria took a deep breath before answering. Because, despite everything, I don't want the worst to happen to you. You don't deserve to pay the price for this war. But if you're going to keep going, you need to know exactly who you're dealing with. It wasn't a plea for her to stop, but a warning to weigh every step carefully from here on. Mary thanked her, but made it clear she wasn't backing down. If I stop now, the truth dies with me. And I can't live with that. Victoria didn't argue, just nodded as if she knew there was no point. Before leaving, she gave one last piece of advice: stay alert. And don't trust anyone who shows up with information that's too easy. They love setting traps. Then she returned to her car and drove away, leaving Mary with more questions than answers. As she walked back to the retirement home, Mary replayed every word. Victoria could have been exaggerating, but something in her tone suggested sincerity. And if it was true? If the flash drive really was only part of a much bigger file? That possibility gnawed at her. There might be more potential allies, but also more hidden enemies than she could imagine. That night, Mary took out the flash drive and stared at it as if it were Pandora's box. Every new piece of information seemed to open the door to even more dangerous secrets. She had no idea that, within days, another unexpected voice would confirm much of what Victoria had said and bring even more explosive proof. The phone call came like a lightning strike on a clear day. Mary was sitting by the window, flipping through a book, when her phone lit up with an unknown number. She answered, and a low, trembling female voice spoke. Mary? This is Caroline Westfield, Michael's wife. Mary frowned in surprise. They had never spoken directly before. Caroline wasted no time. I have evidence against Pinnacle Estates and against James. This isn't just real estate fraud. It's money laundering for very dangerous people. If this gets out, it will destroy them, but it could also put you in serious danger. Her words came quickly, as if every second on the line was a risk. Caroline proposed a meeting the next day. Willow Creek Bridge. 6 p.m. It's open, but away from prying eyes. And please come alone. Mary hesitated. It could be a trap, but she couldn't ignore it either. When she told Diane, her lawyer reacted instantly. Mary, this is far too risky. They could be using you as bait. But Mary had already made up her mind. If Caroline has what she says, it could be the missing piece we need. Diane insisted on precautions: a rental car, a backup phone, and a designated safe point if things went wrong. The morning of the meeting dawned heavy, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky. Mary drove to the bridge with her heart pounding, the hum of the engine merging with the roar of her thoughts. Willow Creek Bridge rose solitary over a fast-moving river, and Caroline was already there, clutching a thick folder to her chest. Her eyes were sharp, the eyes of someone who lived under constant watch. Without delay, she handed the folder to Mary. These are contracts, statements, recordings, even videos. You have to take this straight to the FBI. No press. They will kill to protect this. As Caroline spoke, Mary noticed movement at the far end of the bridge. Two men were approaching fast, focused. Caroline saw them too, and her voice shifted to raw urgency. Run, Mary. A gunshot split the air before any other words could be spoken. Caroline was hit in the chest, the impact sending her crumpling like a rag doll. Mary froze for a split second, her heartbeat drowning out every other sound. Then another shot rang out, and instinct took over. She ran, clutching the folder against her body, the cold air burning her lungs. Gunshots echoed behind her. She reached the car, fumbling to unlock the door with trembling hands. She jumped in, started the engine, and sped off without looking back, the tires hissing on the wet road. Her only goal was to reach safety. She spotted a sign for a police station and swerved sharply, pulling into the lot and parking crookedly. Stumbling out, barely able to breathe, she held the folder out to the desk officer, evidence they killed Caroline. The officer brought her inside while another patrol unit headed to the bridge. Between ragged breaths, she explained everything she'd seen. Minutes later, FBI agents arrived and took over the case. Opening the folder, they confirmed its explosive contents: forged contracts, offshore transactions, videos of meetings between James, Michael, and known organized crime figures. One agent, his face grave, said, "This is pure dynamite. And now, you're at the center of it." Mary sat in silence, trying to process Caroline's death. The image of her falling, eyes wide, flashed in her mind like a blade cutting deep. She felt grief, anger, and an even stronger sense of duty. Caroline had paid with her life to deliver that evidence. Mary couldn't waste that sacrifice. Even in fear, she knew this was the point of no return. The war had escalated to its most dangerous level. That night, back in her room at the retirement home, Mary packed a backup phone and a few personal documents into a small backpack, ready for anything. She knew that from this moment on, her life was officially at risk. But she also understood that every threat, every loss, and every piece of evidence brought her closer to her ultimate goal: to expose the entire criminal network and make sure no one else suffered Caroline's fate. Deep down, she could feel that the time for retaliation was drawing near. The day of the operation began before dawn. Mary was awakened by the persistent ringing of her phone. It was Diane, her voice urgent. "It's happening. The FBI is moving today. I need you to stay in a safe location and far from any chaos." Mary sat up in bed, her pulse racing. Part of her wanted to be there, to see with her own eyes the collapse of their empire. But she knew her role was different now: to stay alive so she could tell the story. As Diane spoke, Mary imagined James and the others waking up, unaware that within hours, their freedom would be gone. The operation was given the codename Black Soil, a nod both to Mary's farm and to the corruption that had seeped into its dealings. Federal agents, supported by local police, fanned out across multiple locations. Pinnacle Estates offices were raided, computers seized, and safes cracked open under court orders. At the same time, the homes of James, Victoria, and Michael Westfield were surrounded. Helicopters circled overhead, and black SUVs blocked driveways to prevent any escape. Mary followed it all on the news. The television showed images of agents carrying out boxes of documents, while reporters tried to capture every detail. When the camera focused on James' house, Mary felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. There he was, head down, hands cuffed, being placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. Victoria was beside him, also in cuffs, her gaze fixed somewhere far away, as if she had already resigned herself to her fate. Michael Westfield, ever arrogant, shouted protests but was quickly silenced by agents. The FBI's official statement came hours later. The charges were severe money laundering, real estate fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, the last one tied directly to Caroline Westfield's death. The press conference was clear: this operation dismantles a criminal network with international reach. The defendants will face the full weight of the law. For Mary, hearing those words was like closing a door on years of fear and uncertainty. But she also knew the legal battle was only beginning. Diane called soon after the press conference. "Mary, we did it. The evidence you and Caroline provided was the key to getting the judge's approval for the operation. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Mary thanked her, though her thoughts were with Caroline, the price paid for this day to happen. It was a victory, but not a clean one. It carried the bittersweet taste of justice bought with sacrifice. Still, she knew her death hadn't been in vain. As the city buzzed with talk of the operation, some residents of the retirement home came to congratulate Mary. She smiled but kept her answers brief. This wasn't a moment to boast, it was a moment to ensure the case stayed strong. Diane was already working on having Mary's farm officially returned through the reversion clause, something that could be resolved in the coming months. It was as though two battles were running in parallel, the criminal case and the civil fight for her land. That night, alone in her room, Mary watched the final news segment of the day. The screen showed the entrance to Pinnacle Estates' office sealed with FBI tape, an agent commenting on the sheer volume of data recovered from their computers. "It will take months to go through all of this," he said. Mary knew that, despite the arrests, there were still loose ends, contacts and accomplices who might never be found. But at least the leaders were behind bars. Switching off the TV, she took a deep breath. The sound of rain against the window felt like it was washing the city clean, as if nature itself wanted to erase the stains left by greed and betrayal. For the first time in years, Mary felt space to imagine a future without the constant weight of threat pressing down on her. The next step would be making sure this story ended in a way that honored Caroline's memory and restored dignity to the land that had always been hers. The trial began months later, but the sense of anticipation had been building long before. The town was talking, the media was watching every move, and the lawyers were preparing like generals before a decisive battle. Mary, though not a formal party in the criminal case, was there nearly every day, seated in the front rows. She wanted to look James in the eye as the evidence was laid out. She wanted him to see that, despite everything, she was still standing. Diane, ever by her side, reminded her that the most important thing now was to stay calm and let the law do its work. The courtroom was packed on the first day. The prosecution laid out a solid narrative, connecting the dots between real estate fraud, money laundering, and the conspiracy to murder Caroline. Richard Westfield's flash drive and the documents Caroline had handed over were shown to the jury, each file projected like another brick in the wall closing in around the defendants. Mary watched in silence, mentally reliving every step that had led her here. It was painful, but necessary. James kept a cold, calculated demeanor throughout the trial, as if he still believed he could walk free. Victoria seemed subdued, avoiding Mary's gaze and the eyes of the jury. Michael Westfield, arrogant as ever, made no effort to hide his disdain for the charges until key witnesses took the stand. Former employees of Pinnacle Estates revealed sordid details of how the money was moved and how threats were used to silence anyone who knew too much. The most damning moment came when the prosecution played recordings from the flash drive. James' voice, chillingly calm, discussing how to handle Caroline before she could deliver the documents. Mary felt her throat tighten hearing him speak so matter-of-factly about ending her life. It wasn't speculation anymore, it was proof, raw and undeniable. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the jury returned with its verdict. James Miller was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to 40 years in prison. Michael Westfield received 30 years, and Victoria, who had partially cooperated with the investigation, was given 15. The man identified as Caroline's shooter was sentenced to life without parole. When the sentences were read, a heavy silence filled the room, followed by a collective murmur. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the decision sink in. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded for interviews, but Mary declined. This was not a victory to celebrate in front of cameras, it was the necessary closing of a chapter marked by pain and struggle. Diane, however, spoke briefly today. Justice was served. But let this be a warning: greed and corruption destroy lives, and there will always be someone willing to fight against them. Mary listened to her friend's words with a mix of pride and relief. In the days that followed, the town slowly returned to its routines, but Mary knew nothing would be quite the same. Even with the convictions, the scars remained. Losing Caroline, facing James' betrayal, finding herself in the middle of a war against a criminal network. Yet there was something new now, an inner freedom, the feeling that she could finally breathe without the constant shadow of danger. And with the trial over, she could turn her attention to another battle, reclaiming her farm under the reversion clause. Now, with the full weight of the law and solid evidence on her side, this step felt not just possible, but inevitable. In her heart, she already knew exactly what she would do with that land once it was hers again. The hearing to reclaim the farm didn't have the drama of a criminal trial, but for Mary Thompson, that day carried just as much weight as all the ones before. Diane presented the case with precision. The reversion clause was still active, the 10-year deadline had passed without the promised sustainable housing being built, and the last owners directly tied to Pinnacle Estates were now convicted of serious crimes. There were no loopholes left to exploit. After reviewing all the documents, the judge spoke the words Mary had been waiting to hear for so long: the property shall return, as of today, to the possession of Mary Thompson. Mary left the courthouse feeling a mix of relief and reverence. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was the symbol of her history, her family's strength, and the roots no criminal scheme had been able to rip out. When she arrived at the farm, the fences were weathered, the grass overgrown, and the barns in need of repair. But to her, every flaw was an invitation to rebuild. She ran her hand over the wood of the porch, took a deep breath, and felt as if the air here carried a different kind of weight, the weight of everything lost and now returned. Her first decision wasn't about planting or renovations. It was about creating something that would outlive her. In the weeks that followed, she founded the Caroline Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing sustainable, affordable housing for families in vulnerable situations. The name was a tribute to the woman who had given her life to ensure the truth came to light. If she died protecting something, Mary said at the opening ceremony, the best way to honor her is to make sure that something brings life to others. Caroline's daughter became the foundation's first beneficiary. Mary welcomed her personally to the farm, handing her the keys to a newly renovated home, built with sustainable materials and powered by solar energy. It was an emotional moment, and for the first time in a long while, Mary felt she was building something purely good. Watching the little girl run across the yard symbolized everything Mary wanted for the future: a place that was safe, fair, and full of possibility. Richard Westfield, the man who had helped by handing over the flash drive in the early stages of the investigation, began visiting the farm often. He became involved in the project, offering resources and connections to help expand the foundation's reach. The bond between them grew naturally, rooted in mutual respect, shared resilience, and the pain of having watched loved ones succumb to greed. Mary wasn't in a hurry to label what they had, but she knew that with him, she felt less alone. The community responded warmly. Volunteers showed up to help repair homes, donations began to pour in, and the Caroline Foundation started appearing in newspapers and on social media. Unlike the attention Shed received during the scandal, Mary was now at the center of a positive story. This didn't erase the past, but it proved that something good could be built from ruins. Every home handed over was like another brick in the rebuilding of her own soul. Sometimes, at dusk, Mary would walk to the highest point of the farm, where she could see the open horizon. In those moments, she thought of everything she had endured: being driven out of Jameis House, discovering the claws, surviving threats, losing Caroline, watching the arrests. Each memory carried its own weight, but also its own lesson. She had learned that justice isn't always swift, but it is possible; that truth is costly, but worth every price; and that starting over requires the courage to face old wounds hidden. The farm was no longer just hers. It was a home for many, and a living symbol that integrity can survive even the most brutal attacks. Mary knew there would still be challenges ahead, but this time, they would be faced with the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be: tending the land, caring for people, and keeping the promise she had made to herself to turn pain into purpose. Mary Thompson's journey proved that even when everything seems lost, truth and determination can turn any game around. Her fight wasn't just for a farm, it was for justice, dignity, and purpose. She showed that when pain is transformed into action, the result can touch far more lives than we ever imagine. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories that prove it's never too late to fight for what's right.